Hello, my name is Arturo Mendoza. I am the director of the Mexican Studies Center, UNAM, South Africa. We are hosted at the University of the Witwatersrand in the School of Literature, Language and Media. And one of our aims is to develop academic activities and to foster institutional collaborations between the National Autonomous University of Mexico and higher education institutions in South Africa. In this regard, the Mexican Studies Center is pleased to announce its webinar series called South-South Dialogues. This webinar aims to address existing and emerging challenges pertinent to the developing world and to discuss subjects of international concern and research from a Global South perspective. The webinar will occur on a monthly basis, and it embraces a wide range of disciplines. I would like to thank the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, the University Program on Asian and African Studies, the University Museum of Contemporary Art, the Mandela Chair for Human Rights, and UNAM's International Head Office for collaborating in this inaugural event with the keynote participation of Professor Sarah Nuttall. Thank you very much. And before we start with a roundtable discussion, we will have some welcoming remarks from our collaborators. So now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Alicia Girón. She is the director of the University Program on Asian and African Studies at UNAM. Thank you. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, Arturo. Well, Sarah, welcome to Mexico. It's really very excited to have you here because since last year we have been trying you to arrive here, and for many, many reasons we just couldn't have you here. But thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And this is just the beginning of other conversations, of other webinars, because when I was last year in Johannesburgo, South Africa is very similar to Mexico, and we have to join a better academic interchange program. Thank you very much and welcome. And we are really very happy to see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alicia. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Francisco Trigo. He is the Vice Provost for International Affairs at UNAM. Thank you, Dr. Trigo.
Thank you very much, Arturo. Good morning, everybody in Mexico. Good evening, everybody in South Africa. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Our relationship with South Africa has been increasing. The first step was to establish our Center for Mexican Studies at Witwatersrand University, and with the presence of Arturo and David, where we are very pleased with the work they have been developing. Also, another key issue was here the presence of Ambassador Sandile Nokshina, who was very persistent in establishing a Nelson Mandela Chair precisely at the National University of Mexico. We managed to complete all the procedures to have formally set up, even with the recognition of the Mandela Foundation. So with this Nelson Mandela Chair on Human Rights, a lot of issues have been discussed, analyzed along these last years. And I recall that we had the presence of Professor Achille Membe last year talking about these very updated issues. And now, as Alicia mentioned, we've been trying to bring Sarah Nuttall over the last months. Unfortunately, the pandemic didn't help us to have her here, as was our wish. But certainly we appreciate a lot, Sarah, your presence today, even though it's on distance, but we are persistent that sometime in the future, you have to visit us here in Mexico City. Will be a pleasure for us having you here. I also want to thank all the speakers who will accompany Sarah today and will certainly enrich our program. Thanks a lot, Garth Stevens, as Dean at the Wits University. Certainly your presence is also well recognized and accepted. So I think we have all the ingredients to have a wonderful discussion for today. And I understand that in the near future, we also have a conference from Sarah Nuttall to the UNAM community, and we are certainly expecting that conference as well. So thank you very much to everybody, and let's have a wonderful morning in Mexico and evening in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Sara Nuttall, Director of the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you very much to Arturo, Alicia, and Francisco. I really appreciate the opportunity for this conversation. I think that those of us who work in the global South take a particular pleasure in what I would call talking South, talking to each other across the South. And I think that it's extraordinary how persistently people say that Mexico City and Johannesburg should be talking to each other. They should have been talking to each other a long time ago in terms of their urban environments and their institutions and some of the key issues that they face in terms of social change and economic inequality. So I'm very grateful to all of you. I think that we have a great deal of work to do in thinking about how we ought to begin to understand universities in the era of global pandemic. And I appreciate the opportunity to have a collaborative and collective discussion on this basis. I'm very, very grateful to Garth Stevens and Sizwe and Mpofu-Walsh for joining me on the South African side this evening. And I find, their ways of thinking about the university in South Africa now invaluable. In short, what has the experience of the first truly global pandemic done to the institution of the university? I think we need to talk about that tonight. And I'm very, very grateful for your presence here. Thank you very much.
Maybe Dr. Trigo, if you can do us the honor to inaugurate the roundtable discussion.
Thank you. Well, simply in a very easy way, wish to everybody that we have a wonderful session this morning in Mexico and this evening in South Africa about this topic that we are going to very carefully listen to, and all the comments from Sara Nuttall and from the guest speakers, and let's have a wonderful session. Thank you for everybody for being present at this important meeting. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. So just before we start with the discussion, I would like to read Sara Nuttall's bio. Obviously, the topic of today is rethinking the university in the age of COVID-19. A discussion between colleagues at the Wits University, Johannesburg, and the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City. And very briefly, Sara Nuttall is Professor of Literary and Cultural Studies and Director of WISER, which is the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg, South Africa. She is the author of Entanglement, Literary and Cultural Reflections on Post-Apartheid, editor of Beauty, Ugly, African and Diaspora Aesthetics, and co-editor of many books, including Negotiating the Past, The Making of Memory in South Africa, Senses of Culture, Johannesburg, The Elusive Metropolis, and Load Shedding, Writing on and Over the Edge of South Africa. She has given more than 30 keynote addresses around the world and published more than 60 journal articles and book chapters. Her work is widely cited across many disciplines, and in 2016, she was an Oppenheimer Fellow at the Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. For 8 years, she has directed WISER, which is the largest and most established humanities institute across the Global South. Thank you very much again, Sara, and I will give you the floor now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arturo. I've very much enjoyed working with you on this event, and I appreciate very much what you've done to make it happen. Colleagues, I would like to turn our thoughts to how we might think about the university in the context of the year of 2020, which is really the first truly global pandemic that we've experienced. But immediately to say that we ought to be mapping that conversation onto earlier ways in which the university has thought about itself, been contested, and in the language that I want to try to use tonight and to develop a little bit, has redistributed itself across multiple terrains and in many, many different ways. So one of the things I'm interested in using the vocabulary of redistribution is to put center in our discussions this evening the question of economic justice, which after all is the first meaning of redistribution. But interestingly, it is also a term which is used to think about building a system of reciprocities within a collective. And I'd like to think about both of those senses, of the term. And I'd also like us to extend the term redistribution to other aspects of university life, which I think have been very important and are coming into focus in profound ways in this year of the pandemic. And one of those relates to the question of how an institution might redistribute a sense of belonging amongst multiple constituencies that it serves and is served by. How it might work in relation to claims to be listened to, claims on the institution, and contestations over it, particularly by student voices. How we might think about redistribution in relation to long-standing debates on the university, but particularly acute, I think, in the last sort of 5 to 8 years, alongside student struggles for the university and for the future of the university in this country, which have to do with where does the university place its inside and its outside. In other words, where and how does the university think about its relationship to the social? And how does it manage the borders between the society that it is and is not part of, as it tries to become an institution which is future inflected? So that seems to be, a set of layers to the question around redistribution that I would very much like to be in conversation with colleagues about this evening. Of course, questions of social justice are absolutely key to questions of redistribution. And I see decolonization and decolonization imperatives as being part and parcel of what I'm calling this evening, in the context of this debate, redistribution. But I also want to put sort of firmly on the table for discussion tonight the question of rapid technological change. Universities have been starting to inhabit their online environments over the last 5 years in particular. But of course, what we've seen in this age of the escalating epidemiological and its outbreak phenomena is the large-scale moving online of the university, to the degree that one almost thinks about a university taking flight from its physical structures and material infrastructures. And I would really like to debate with colleagues what we think about in relation to the way in which our universities are phasing the parameters of its online and offline terrains. So in short, I think that redistribution is a very useful concept for thinking about the university now, in the sense that it's the opposite, at least in the sense that I want to use it as a manner of opening our discussion. It's the opposite of what we might think as outsourcing. It's the opposite of offshoring, as one might find in private universities today. And it's the opposite of the redistribution of human life in general in relation to enclaving in the aftermath of apartheid histories, now redistributing themselves across the world. So, all of these things are very important. I think that the pandemic has thrown into profound focus something about the communities that make up a university that were once sent off campus or offshore or negatively redistributed. And that, of course, is university workers who were once not regarded as central to the mission and operations of the university, were outsourced, and of course now have been redefined as essential workers. And I think there's something very profound there that can point us to the kinds of important lessons we need to look for in relation to the age of the pandemic. Just to elaborate very briefly on where the inside and the outside of the university might be. We've lived through, I think, many years of debate, certainly in South Africa and probably in Mexico, in relation to whether the university could be an asylum of sorts, which could play some kind of protective role, against the harshness and immediacy of the social. We've also had, I think, debates around the sort of growing crisis in the humanities, in the sense that so much work that universities used to do in the humanities is now sort of unmoored from the university and eminently searchable online. These are all sort of issues that I explored in my podcast. So I think that these are very, very important, but really facing us now for the first time is this notion that, of Wits's 37,000 students, for example, Most of them, as well as most South African students at this point, are online, neither inside nor outside the university, but on screens in cyberspace. Many having been taught on WhatsApp rather than Microsoft Teams because of data disparities and the digital divide, with no contact with the place they took to be the site of learning. So in the first instance, I think we need to take very seriously the student experience, being disconnected, not only from the physical structures of the university, but all that that has meant, particularly to working class students, where universities represent not only a pathway, a tangible pathway to graduation and then hopefully employment, but also questions of Wi-Fi, freedom, privacy, and space. All of these things, I think, are up for grabs and are very difficult to deal with. The second thing I want to raise very quickly is, what the status is of the so-called international knowledge commons that we're all participating in, including on the screen tonight. And what are the stakes, in that process and for that process? And this is a discussion I've had with Garth Stevens, and I hope he'll amplify it in his remarks tonight, in asking about how can we keep such an international commons, knowledge commons open? At what point will we have to subscribe and pay for access to these intellectual conversations? And that seems a really very important new struggle for all of us to begin to fight, most particularly in the global south. So those kinds of questions are important, and attendant upon them are this question: what kinds of resources in all senses, intellectual, technological, financial, and symbolic, will we need to foster this kind of openness to the world at large? And none of this, of course, is the same as what we took until very recently to be the global university, which was really all about inequalities of a massive scale between North and South, involving who could travel, who could get a visa, who could cross those borders to even have those intellectual conversations, quite aside from questions of digital access and so on. So I wonder what the resources are that we're going to need. Now, let me conclude by making 4 very, very quick points, which we may not cover in their entirety in our discussion, but which I think we should keep on our radar as we develop this collaboration going forward, and in conversation with all the people who are joining us on Facebook this evening. Here's one. What does a university and a knowledge project become without the orders of sociality and intimacy provided by the university corridor? Many people have noticed that the stakes of the argument, the terms of disagreement, the capacity to read nuance or follow up on an exchange, and the navigation of care, community, and the collective, if not personal mental health questions, rely on some kind of communal and spirited life of an institution rather than the flattening of the online terrain. What is it doing to the nature of the arguments and the possibilities of the engagements that we're having? Secondly, what about our systems and distributional modes of internationalization, which we've relied on for quite a long time to conduct the business that we do in institutes and in faculties? Internationalization has tended, as a distributional logic, to work across questions like recruiting international students, developing branch campuses, trying to internationalize our curricula, but often in very generic and replicable ways, and of course developing exchange programs with the South or with the North, depending on where we are. But of course the economies of scale are almost incomparable between North and South, especially as the wealth gap increases. The global economy is now 28 trillion poorer than it was before the pandemic. How are we going to think about that? Thirdly, what does our fast redistributing university mean for North-South relations? And this is of great concern to us being in the South, across Mexico City and Johannesburg. On the one hand, we know, the equities of North and South and their skewed and unfair distributed knowledge regimes. On the other hand, vocabularies of North and South can sometimes be very complex, not always straightforwardly mappable, and also at different times quite innovating to the flow of the free flow of thought and research imaginations. Is it North, is it South, etc. So I wonder if we could debate at some point what a critical humanities project must do, which is to emerge from its location and its sense of place, but also resist both the university and the South as an enclave. I think that's something one wants to resist in a redistributed university imagination. And finally, it does seem to me that our newest distributional challenge is a serious confrontation with new knowledge architectures, a redistributive architecture of knowledge design, if you like, most especially between the life sciences and the earth sciences and the humanities, as we try to navigate the state of the planet and huge environmental damage and crisis. What kinds of research projects can we envisage across the South and in our universities? And I'll just finish by noting that it's been quite difficult, in my view, at Wits University, and for very good historical reasons, to generalize the debate about environmental change across the social sciences, rather than in niche sort of enclaves, if you like, of discussion. Now, just to conclude my comments, if the redistributed university is in some senses a diagnostic tool, which I hope it is, it's also a conceptual resource for trying to find a future based on a more reciprocal relationality in the work of knowledge production, and in our interests across the global South, of course. And of course, if we want to build something like a university commons, which I think we should, in contradistinction to the neoliberal university of recent years, disputing its vocabularies and practices, trying to build possible solidarities and conceptual vocabularies that restore us to the dual projects of care and critique, then I think we have to focus on who's at the table. And of course, so often African intellectuals are not at the table, so often under the sign of the global humanities and so on. African intellectuals are very often not there. And I'm quite sure that intellectuals from Latin America and Mexico specifically are at that table only sometimes. And so I think all of these issues confront us as we try to go forwards. And it's my absolute pleasure now to very, very briefly introduce our panel for this evening in the order in which they'll speak. Nair and Anaya is Professor of Literature in the Faculty of Philosophy and Letras at UNAM. And she works in the fields of post-coloniality, interculturality, and translation studies. And she's here tonight specifically because she's developed alternative ways of teaching what are often taken as canonical texts in these fields. Today, she'll speak first and specifically address how, in the context of the immediate need for scientific and technological knowledge to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, we might rethink the work of and our need for a redistributed humanities in the university today. Now, Imanol Ordorika is a professor in the social sciences, economics, and education at UNAM, and works amongst other areas on questions of power, politics, and change in higher education in Mexico. He's also a visiting professor at UJ in Johannesburg, and so he has the benefit of knowing both of our contexts this evening. He's spoken recently on the topic of the repoliticization of the university, and I hope that he will place this in conversation with my notion of the redistributed university as we broadly defined it today. He wants, I know specifically, to consider how universities today might meet their commitments to society across the global South in particular. Garth Stevens, who will speak third, is Professor of Psychology and very much admired and appreciated Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Wits University, which, by the way, has just been announced as the leading higher education institution on the African continent. He works on race, violence, trauma, and memory, and has published widely in these areas. He's also provided strong and principled leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic this year, and has thought very deeply about how to steer the university forwards in relation to ongoing questions of economic inequality and social justice, as well as emerging hybrid models of teaching and learning. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh has a doctorate from Oxford University in International Relations on nuclear weapon-free zones, and he's finishing his second work of nonfiction on South African politics, specifically from the vantage point of a younger generation. He's based at WISER as a postdoctoral fellow. Sizwe was previously involved in student struggles for change in universities, both here and abroad, and we'll very much value his perspectives today on the redistributed university in relation to the decolonizing university in part, and also in relation to the making of knowledge futures via the public humanities and recalibrated ways of doing academic research in the present and aftermath of the pandemic that we are living through. So a very warm welcome to you all, and over to you, Nair. Thank you.
Hello to you all. I am very glad to be sharing with you this roundtable, and I thank the PUEA for the invitation. Well, this is a very ambitious project, and there is no way we can talk about it in sort of 10 minutes. But I want just to talk about two things that have happened recently, and I think that they can contribute to rethink many of the things that happen at universities and the need for these university commons that you are talking about. Much has been said and written about the fact that the COVID pandemic has acted as a catalyst, which has brought to the surface a number of issues that have been there for a number of years, if not decades. It has also precipitated social inequality all over the world, but even more in our societies. In the next few pages, I want to offer a modest reflection of some of the events that have affected our university in recent months. And from there, and based on some of your ideas, Sarah, to insist on the need for a redistribution of humanistic thought that may contribute to a better education. I'm going to start with some very basic information about UNAM that may serve as a hinge to talk about some other things. UNAM, as you know, is the most important educational institution in Mexico and currently has 360,000 students, 51 of which are women, and very few come from indigenous communities. Its main campus, inaugurated in 1955, is now a UNESCO heritage site on account of its holistic architectural conception, which also incorporated the natural elements of its volcanic surroundings. This is important because it means that it cannot be changed architecturally, and this affects directly the building of the Faculty of Philosophy and Literature. The campus also articulated the ideals of a mestizo society, which was on the verge of reaching a modernity which sadly was never fully achieved in the end. But the UNAM was not founded in 55. It has a much longer history that goes back as far as 1553, when the Royal Pontifical University of Mexico was created. This brief historical account may offer a glimpse of some of the aspirations, challenges, and problems that characterize our institution in 2020. Throughout the 20th century, going to UNAM offered the possibility of social promotion by becoming a professional. But did this really imply that it was forming conscious subjects? Unfortunately, some of the problems we are facing today come precisely from the dislocation between what it means to become a professional and what it means to have a critical instance on some of the basic tenets of being Mexican nowadays. As my colleague Sebastian Pla stated recently in one of these roundtables related to COVID precisely, a fundamental role of the university should be that those professionals acquire and are formed into a notion of subject that transcends the inequalities that not only surround us, but which are embedded in the very structures of our society, which are patriarchal, machista, and profoundly discriminatory in racial, ethnic, social, gender, and caste terms. The COVID contingency has been indirectly related to two situations that may illustrate what I want to address here, and which provide two examples of the need for a redistributed university. As in many other parts of the world, and in the context of the Me Too campaign, a number of protests related to gender violence have been taking place at UNAM in recent years, and increased in last year after one female student was killed in the campus and another from our faculty disappeared on her way to the university. These are related, of course, and have to be considered in the context of this other epidemic Mexico is suffering, that of thousands of feminicides each year. These demonstrations very often consist in the occupation of premises, which can last for several months, as was the case of my school, the Faculty of Philosophy and Literature, which was taken over from last November to April. Their just demands helped to accelerate a long-awaited modification of the university's statutes, which now consider and actually name, and that's important, gender violence as a major breach of conduct that needs to be formally addressed and penalized. The protest also helped to implement a change in the curriculum of the 15 disciplines taught at the faculty. Apart from the 80 courses and seminars related to feminist literature and thought that had been read roughly for decades and each semester, students now have to attend several gender-oriented courses, and they have to begin with one before they start their freshers year, especially to bring to the surface the need for a good code of conduct. The occupation only ended when COVID became a tangible threat and the university had gone into lockdown. Paradoxically then, our faculty could only start a new term 4 months after the official UNAM calendar, amid mixed feelings, grateful for being able to restart our schooling, but also concerned for solving and giving continuity to the complex gender problematic. In concrete, this has taken the form, among others, of interdisciplinary and collective courses and seminars on gender issues, as well as offering psychological assistance to those who require it, either by the impact of COVID or because of a gender-related problematic or any other. Many of our students do not live in Mexico City, they live in the countryside. And the question of internet connection was a real problem. So immediately, and that was a very interesting project of our dean at the faculty, tablets were immediately distributed to students who needed them. And this has been taken by the university as a whole, and now they are offering tablets forever they need it. We still have a problem for the idea of going back. When are we going to be able to go back? Our building was built in '55, contemplating 1,000 students. Our actual population is 12,000. So there is no way that in the future months and perhaps years, we're going to be able to have the same dynamics that we had before. And just another interesting thing, as a result of the COVID, now we are able to have training for online resources, and 6,500 professors and lecturers have been taking part in them. The second example is not directly related to the university, but shows why it is fundamental to fight for an increased presence of the humanities in society. As a result of the COVID pandemic, a group of right-wing conservative protesters have increased their demonstrations against the current president, López Obrador. That the president should have opposition is not new, but what I want to underline is the imagery and lexicon they employ, because it articulates the profound racial, ethnic, social discrimination that continues to prevail in our country. They see themselves as the gente bonita, beautiful people, which basically means white, blonde if possible, high and middle class, and Catholic. They consider the rest of the Mexican population, and especially those who voted for López Obrador, as ignorant, prietos, dark-skinned, and resentful. Their warring cry is Viva Cristo Rey, used during the fascist religious rebellion of the 1920s and 30s, and Down with Communism, which is interestingly, it was interestingly expressed in a poster, but one of the illustrated ladies. I don't want a country where my maid is my boss. This may seem merely anecdotal, but it is significant because it offers a glimpse of all that remains to be done at the university in general and at UNAM in particular. Only through the education and research in the humanities can we try to change those long-standing prejudices and imaginaries. It is not an exaggeration to say that a large part of Mexico's population and of UNAM's community see themselves as Western in cultural affiliation, in education, in consumption habits, and in expectations. Only by the redistribution of knowledges and spaces can the university contribute to an overall change of mind and attitude. The task has been slow and began quite late, but it is there and advancing. UNAM created a program to acknowledge the multicultural nature of our country in 2004. And in 2014, it became a program to study cultural diversity and interculturality, a program which includes grants and support to students from indigenous communities, 900 this semester, and only about 16 for African descendants. In UNAM's structure, a program of this kind is the previous stage to becoming a research center and then a research institute. So there is still a long way to go. This can be said also by the program that is hosting us today, the program of Asian and African Studies. An important priority then should be a real and complete integration of these fields of research into the accepted curricula of our humanistic and social science disciplines. In the Modern Languages and Literatures department, which is where I work, a new curricula was approved only last month, and it integrated the study of post-colonial literatures as part of the literary history courses. We had been reading and teaching those literatures for almost 40 years, but only now has it been possible to officially integrate the change. Some of us see it as a very significant because those other apparently marginal literatures have allowed us to open new horizons to our students. Africa and Afro-descendant culture in Mexico are almost invisible and negated concerns in our milieu. And to study them is a debt we owe to the future generations, and we also owe them the incorporation of indigenous authors and intellectuals. The COVID pandemic has placed into a new perspective two interesting projects that I want to comment. One is Meridian 105, created with no funding by Claudia Lucotti from the Modern Languages Department and with the student participation. It is a small but ongoing digital project which presents the poetry of Mexican and Canadian women written in indigenous languages. In addition, the reader has access to each individual poem in its original indigenous language, read by the poet, as well as in translation into English, French, and Spanish, and some of the other indigenous languages, which include Cree, Innu, Maya, Purépecha, Triqui, Celtal, Tzotzil, Wixárika, Zapotec, and Zoque. The reader can access each poem in any language so that the usual relation between original and translation is broken, thus inviting us to reflect on art, language, culture, history, and the circulation of non-hegemonical texts. The name of the anthology comes from the meridian that crosses all of North America, a fictional axis between Canada and Mexico. And so it breaks this division north-south, west, non-west. What is the opposite of west in our case? The second example is the decision by the UNAM publishing department, the central one, to change the editorial line of a series dedicated to the promotion of literature from a hegemonical selection to one that privileges Latin American women writers who were marginalized by the male gaze that has prevailed in literature. Hopefully, this will include the work of Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Caribbean authors, not only from the Spanish-speaking area, but also from the Francophone and Anglophone region. This point is important here and is related to this idea of having a true university commons and a commons of knowledge in the humanities because of the problems of copyright. The high cost of certain databases like JSTOR and Muse Project, etc. One example is that we did an anthology of African short stories some years ago. It's a 2-volume one, and it took us 6 years after completing the translations to really get the rights or the permissions to publish them. So this is part of my participation. I just want to stress that we are all together here precisely because of the COVID pandemic. So it in a way has forced us to open new channels of communication and to recognize the existence of other communities that share many of our preoccupations and challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry about the mute button. Somebody has to get rid of it. Thank you very much.
I know.
Thank you very much. Imanol, over to you.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank all of you here at the panel. I want to thank Arturo and Alicia Girón for the Mexican counterpart that put together this opportunity to interact with some colleagues from South Africa. I've been fortunate enough to be in South Africa 3 times, and I have very, very good colleagues, even from our student days. Some of them you might know, Aaron Rensburg, previous Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Michael Cross, Sop Ahmed, and others, many others. And I have always been fascinated by the history of South Africa and its some analogies with the history of Mexico, both colonial countries acquiring independence at different points in time, multiracial with a strong colonial presence up to our day, even though, and I'll talk a little bit about it, what has become colonial for us might be slightly different nowadays. I really want to engage Sarah's notion of redistributive university. I listened to the podcast, and I have to say that this is the first time that I was in contact with this concept or this analytical device, and in my view, you have used it, Sarah, in the podcast and here. And you said it a little while ago I'd say at least in 3 dimensions. One, as a conceptual resource in terms of like analytical lens of how to view the university in a continuum between non-redistributive versus redistributive. Second, you said it as a diagnostic tool. This is pretty much connected to the first one, which can allow us to see how well the university is addressing some social concerns, I could say, and or some social orientation. And the third one would be like in an aspirational sense, in terms of what we would like the university to look like. A university that would be connected to redistribution of income, wealth, and cultural capital amongst much broader populations in our societies and each of our nations and the worldwide level. I think it's a very useful concept, and I connected myself with 2 basic ideas that I have used for some time now in order to work, to do some work about universities in Mexico, Latin America, and at the broader level. First is the notion that was put forward for education in general by Carnoy and Levin, that education is a site of contest, of societal contest, everywhere and at every educational level. They did the work in education and work in a democratic society, especially for what they very critically described as democratic societies like the one in the United States, where party politics and government agencies were connected to this contest within education. I think that that concept has to be broadened to societies that are politically organized in different ways, that might be considered democracies or not, but in which the political processes are not essentially conducted through party politics, parliament, Congress, and where social movements play a much more important role, which is the case of South Africa and Mexico for a long time. What is the contest all about? The first notion put forward by them was that there was an inherent tension in education and in higher education that was focusing on the pressures upon the institutions and the higher ed systems all over the world in order to increase capital accumulation. And on the other hand, societal pressures in order to make universities and higher education systems address issues of social justice, democracy, human rights, and other issues of inequality, for example, gender issues, which are very significant nowadays. No? So if those tensions exist in institutions inherently, and we could even say structurally, or although I don't mean by that that the confrontation takes place only at the level of structure, but it's very cultural, especially in higher education institutions, then we have to conclude that universities are political institutions in society. This has been very much criticized and denied by scholars, by university administrators, by government officials, almost all over the world. The university, my university, the UNAM's bylaws that were established in 1945 have in the introduction to the initiative that gave birth to this it's called the organic law because it established the government forms for the university and was approved by federal Congress, has a very big chapter arguing about the need to eradicate politics from the university, which in historical terms, what it has translated upon is that only a few groups have had the right to make institutional decisions, apparently completely deprived of politics, allegedly also in a very pluralistic notion that they represent the common good of all the members of the university and society as a whole, because by being non-political, they are really putting forward the agenda, the common agenda of knowledge, which is uncontested, and there is no conflict about it. Even though there has been a lot of historical evidence in universities themselves about the fact that there have been student movements, the creation of unions, conflicts with university authorities and the government, we still have the same bylaws. And there is a strong reluctance by university officials nowadays to recognize the fact that politics are being played every day at the university level. And Nair has talked a little bit about the fact that the latest expression of this political mobilization by students have been the collective organizations of female students that have really brought into the open something that has been happening for in all the history of the university, where there are a lot of faculty members that are harassing and have committed violence against students, against female students, and this has been totally covered up by local administrators. And finally, there has been the need to acknowledge this, and this is because the students themselves, the female students, really struggled in such a way that nobody at the university was able to close their eyes, attempt to detach themselves from something that has been a reality for ages. But in addition to this very central point of tension of this very political institution of society, the university itself, we have had previous tensions about access. For example, when university officials have attempted to increase tuition, we have a virtually free tuition because it's so low, it's like 20 cents of a dollar per student per year. And and I say we because I was part of a student movement that was very successful in keeping it there. And the university officials have been always reluctant to totally remove the fee. It's so ridiculous to charge 20 cents of a dollar a year to students and not recognize that our university is free. And the movements, the student movements that were able in 1987 and 1992 and 1999 to maintain the university virtually free were so successful that the current government has put into the constitution that public higher education has to be free. And in spite of that, because of the contradictions of the federal government, and this is why I want to stress the political part of the process, they have put not enough money into public higher education in order to make this idea, this reality of free higher education available for all students, male or female. We have struggled for many decades in order to change a very authoritarian political regime in Mexico. The outcome of the Mexican Revolution, which was a very popular-based revolution and produced changes in education, in the property of natural resources, in the giving land to the peasants, and setting up a very strong, popular-based constitution, socially oriented, that has been changes since the coming in of first structural adjustment policies by the International Monetary Fund, and then what we call neoliberal policies by the World Bank. They have been eroded in the Mexican Constitution. Privatization processes have been coming in. Less funding has come for public universities. And in that context, there have been struggles to defend public education against neoliberal policies for many, many years, but also to get rid of the authoritarian nature of university governance in public institutions. I have done some research on the ways in which vice chancellors and chancellors are appointed, or presidents or rectors are appointed in universities at the worldwide level. And here we have been befuddled by the idea, this very ideological notion that only a selected group of scholars that claim to be non-political can guarantee the right leadership for universities. This is the case for UNAM. We are almost 400,000 people at UNAM, 360,000 students, almost 40,000 faculty members, full-time and non-full-time, and 37,000 staff, administrative and manual laborers. So this is a huge institution. And our rector and our deans are appointed by a body of 15 people. And usually these people are so conservative that if you were to mention this notion of redistributive university, they would say, oh, no, no, no. What does this mean regarding excellence and merit? And how could you talk about equality? Equality goes against merit. We only want to give the students that really deserve the chance to get into the institutions. We can only promote the people that are really very prestigious into top faculty positions. And what we have developed is a university in which, if it not were for student struggles, the number of students would be much smaller, and the amount of students that come from families that are not wealthy would not be so large. The UNAM and its virtually free condition, and the fact that we have like high schools that are connected to the university that have like sort of an automatic transition into the university. And this is where students from lower academic, socioeconomic backgrounds get into the institution. If the students in their diverse movements hadn't been able to hold this up, to maintain it, to keep it in place, then we would have a much more elitist institution.
I think we need to move shortly to the other two speakers, otherwise we're going to run out of time.
I just want to finish with two ideas.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Now that gender is at the core of university conflicts all over the world, and I would say there are still, in spite of the advances that Nair talked about, three big issues of gender inequality at Latin American universities in general. First, violence against women. By no means we have been able to get rid of it. And I include institutional violence by faculty, by workers at the university against students and female faculty. Second, access. Even though it's true that we have 51% of female participation in the student body, from every 140 applicants to the university, female applicants, you get 10 inside. And from every 100 male applicants, you also get 10. So there's a much smaller percentage of women getting into the university. It's not representative of the size of the population. And third, and this is very important, the top echelons of academic careers are still male dominated. The emeritus professors, the top full professor positions are basically in the largest proportion, like 70-30% male. And this is based allegedly on a very objective assessment that is allegedly gender neutral. We have to address these issues in order to not become an asylum, to recognize ourselves as political institutions, to repoliticize the university in order to address all the inequalities and all the responsibilities by universities to be able to really touch upon inequality inside and outside our universities. Thank you. I'm sorry that I went beyond.
No, thank you so much. Thanks very much. So we move now to South Africa, to Johannesburg and to Wits University. And I'll invite Garth Stevens to speak to us next.
Thanks. Thanks, Sarah. You'll keep me on track with time here if necessary. So I take it I've got 10 minutes. But thank you to you, Sarah. Thank you to Arturo. Thank you to WISE and to UNAM. I mean, it's really great to be here, to be part and parcel of a conversation and a dialogue with all of you colleagues in rethinking the university in the age of COVID-19. I have to say, like Imanol, I thought that Sarah and I had an opportunity very briefly to chat about this, before this particular webinar, to really talk about the redistributed university. And I have to say that I find it a really useful conceptual tool and a kind of lens through which to look at, in particular, the kinds of work around economic justice and reciprocity. And of course, we're not talking only about economic justice and reciprocity inside the institution itself, but also across institutions and also in relation to the institution's connectedness to the social context in which it is located itself. And so for me, this really is a kind of resource that is able to traverse these kinds of relationalities in interesting ways. They speak to the idea also that this is a dynamic and a changing space that draws on multiple traditions. And I want to stress the idea of multiple traditions, partly because, we often think about the university in very particular ways. For many of us who've trained, in the contemporary university, our idea of the university is really a pre-1960s notion of the university. Quite frankly, that university doesn't exist any longer. That university has come and gone a long time ago, but it remains a kind of archetypal notion for us about what the university is, a secular knowledge project that is devoid of state intervention, etc. When in reality, of course, the university has very much become privatized as an institution and has been complicit in some ways in the commoditization and commodification of knowledge inside this thing that we refer to as the global knowledge economy. So I want to make a few comments because I can see that time's going to fly by very quickly here. But of course, the idea of a redistributed university is not a new one. Universities, if we consider that they are dynamic spaces, are constantly being redistributed in some way or another. But COVID-19 has certainly brought about specific implications. Universities themselves are contested spaces that mirror the social issues, the fractures, the cleavages, the nodes of power and the resistances that emerge from them. In other words, the moves and counter moves that one sees in social formations are also reflected inside the university itself. But of course, COVID has really amplified these contestations and contradictions. And I do want to make this point that actually what COVID does is it brings about contradictory effects. It is not either good nor bad, but it is really deeply contradictory. And I think we need to be mindful of this. Universities in the main have there's been a northern or western hegemony, taking into consideration Sarah's caveat about this, but where knowledge production, knowledge traction, the number of institutions, the hierarchization of partnerships, the economic strengths of institutions, and certainly the kind of extractive model has really been dominated by universities in the global north and certainly in the west. But of course, there have also been rebound effects even here. So for example, these rebound effects have certainly been rebound effects at the economic level for many institutions from the global north. And here, of course, they've had to rely much more significantly on international students. They've already had to think about an extension of this into satellite campuses so that you can study abroad, but really be at home while you're studying abroad. What this has also brought about is another set of internal contradictions, and that is that it's compelled universities in the global north to recalibrate their relationships to the global south in some ways, partly because partnerships have become necessary as they become more and more reliant on elements of the global south itself. Walter Scheidel, in his 2018 book called The Great Leveler, speaks about violence and inequality and really indicates that there are four key processes that have really shaped and challenged inequality across the world. The first being mass war, the second being revolution, the third being the collapse of states, and the fourth being global pandemics. And of course, this really brings us to the kind of nub of where it is that we find ourselves today. While Scheidel is perhaps correct about thinking through this historically, again, I want to come back to the point that I think that that COVID-19 really brings about a contradictory set of outcomes rather than a simple set of outcomes that suggests that the world is potentially a better place post-COVID or potentially a worse place. Sarah, in her podcast has, and certainly in our opening remarks today, has spoken about the redistributed university across a number of dimensions. Some of these being technology, social justice, space, temporalities, economic justice, people or subjects, and of course distributional regimes of knowledge, both in the way that knowledge is produced, but also in the way that knowledge is disseminated. And I want to perhaps speak about some of these, if I may, Sarah. I want to take some of these and really speak to the kind of contradictions for me in each of these spaces. So, you know, when we think about temporalities and time, certainly one of the things that you've spoken about, Sarah, is how in the past, the university has become a place where time itself is being contested. The idea of post-apartheid South Africa and the kind of continuities or discontinuities that students certainly raised about the legacy and the ongoing persistence of racialized inequalities in South Africa. But of course, there's a new element of time that's been raised by COVID-19, and that is the notion of sequential time inside the university. Sequential time and teaching, for example, the very notion of the timetable has in some ways been partly responsible for the limitations to access for many people. What COVID-19 has done together with technology, it's brought about a kind of refocusing on synchronous and asynchronous teaching capacities, and it's meant that the possibilities for education and greater access, because you're not bound by the temporalities of a sequential calendar and a sequential timetable, is really something that one needs to think quite carefully about, because I think it opens up a new way of thinking about architectures of learning inside the university. The downside, and I'm simply going to give one example of a downside here. The downside of this, of course, is that that time inside the academy, what this has done for many staff members, as many of you will know, is that it's really ensured that we work much longer hours. There is the potential that what COVID-19 has done is that it may act as the single largest threat to one of the biggest gains of the labor movement, and that is the 40-hour working week. It extends our time, it collapses and truncates notions of day and night, off time and on time, into a kind of perpetual motion of labor and intellectual labor that has to occur. And this is something that I think one has to be really mindful about inside a knowledge project. In terms of people, of course, Sarah's all raised the issue about how it is that there's been a kind of evening of playing fields. In a moment where you've had a pandemic, the people who are most marginal, most precarious inside the labor sector are, of course, now considered to be the most essential: cleaning staff, administrators, etc., to make sure that the institution survives. This is an important gain, I think, for labor inside educational institutions like universities. But of course, you know, this is not new. We've seen this in the history of pandemics across the world. In the Middle Ages, pandemics brought about the capacity to leverage greater wages, greater living conditions, etc., better living conditions for labor at that particular point in time. But the downside of this is that you also potentially see the atomization of intellectual labor inside the institutional environment. You also potentially see job cuts in the sector. And I say this in a very significant way. Australia has just released a stat, and it's suggesting that something like 10% of its staff will be without jobs, and mostly those people who are already casualized labor. And so the precarity of intellectual labor inside spaces can also be amplified by COVID-19. In terms of space, I think that there's an important issue here about how it is that universities will start to realize that they do not rely on space physically any longer. But we must not forget, again, that there are those who rely on the physical space for infrastructure, for support, etc. Those students who, for example, are most marginal, again, who rely on the infrastructural support of institutions are going to be most disadvantaged by this. And we have to be mindful also of the fact that where governments do subsidize institutions, they subsidize them based partly on space. And one of the things that I would certainly say we would need to be careful about is the way that you can start to see a decline in state resourcing and funding for institutions like universities based on this. The last point that I really want to make here is sorry, two last points here. I know I'm getting to 10 minutes here. But the two last points that I really want to make is really about technology. What technology has done, it really has provided us with great access. It's increased the possibility of those who could not physically be on campuses and now having access to university education. In other words, the possibility of reducing the digital divide that Africa, that is so pronounced in Africa, with all kinds of blended, hybrid, high-flex models of teaching. In 2019, there was an estimated $18.6 billion spent on online educational platforms. The prediction for 2025 is that we will spend something in the region of $350 billion US globally. So again, I raise this partly because I think it's important to think through how it is that neoliberalism and capital has the kind of degree of elasticity that also appropriates opportunities that could have given rise to greater forms of equality, actually to monetize these and to also place place this at the center of profiteering. In terms of knowledge, of course, 1.5% of global indexed knowledge today really comes from a place like Africa. And of course, we think about the possibility of COVID really inverting this. The idea of an international knowledge commons, the idea of new architectures of partnerships where universities in the global north are much more concerned about being isolated and using a so-called soft footprint to ensure that they retain connections to the global south. And these are all really important because they start to articulate the possibility of new borderlands for universities to cultivate structures and relationships that extend beyond what it is that the university has traditionally been. I say this, of course, knowing that the possibility for extractivism remains. The decolonial turn, for example, is one such instance where we see decolonial narratives and discourses emerging partly from the global south, but then very quickly being appropriated into the discourse and narratives of the global north. And I think one has to be careful that, in fact, even though we envisage a potential international knowledge commons, that this is not a new site for a new form of extractivism at an intellectual level. Let me end by saying that I raise these contradictions, Sarah, partly because I think that we need to be absolutely clear that this is not an either or. But actually, if we are wanting to benefit from the optimal outcomes that have presented themselves as a consequence of COVID-19, that we are going to have to think about bending the arc of the model universe in the direction of social justice in a much more deliberate political way, or this, in fact, will not simply happen. Thank you. Sarah, you're still on mute.
There we are. Garth, thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. Always so acute on the double-edgedness of these questions. Our final speaker is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. I hand over to him now.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and greetings to you all. It's a great honor and a privilege to be with you on this panel, and very excited to be able to engage with colleagues from Mexico as well as from South Africa. And hi to everyone who's streaming as well. So I think the concept of a redistributive university is a provocative and a useful one. And what I'd really like to do in my set of fairly brief provocations is to suggest that the term can be useful as a political project in reinvigorating the university and challenging the university to be a more fair and egalitarian space. But I also think that we can extend the concept to highlight some of the threats that are imminent in this moment to the university. And I think that as the university has in some ways redistributed itself outwards in this time of crisis, power has also reconfigured and redistributed itself, and that has had an impact on the university. And so the direction of redistribution is not always in the direction of optimal fairness. And so it's that ambiguity, following to some extent on from what Professor Stevens has said, that I think it is important to grapple with. And I want to do this by just looking at three brief areas. Firstly, the university as a site of contestation. Secondly, the increasing digitality of this moment. And then thirdly, looking at some of the opportunities that arise from this moment. So firstly, I think that, you know, in this moment of profound rupture, one of the things that we've lost, and one of the things that I certainly lament, is that universities in South Africa, historically, and certainly in Mexico too, have been sites of spaced contestation. They've been sites of political contestation and dissent, and have played increasingly important roles in recent years, certainly in South Africa and by the sounds of things in Mexico, as sites of dissent, not just as sites of political protest, but as spaces for convening those protests, not only for challenging internal university structures, but also looking outward onto society. And in South Africa, this is particularly acute because just 5 years ago, an unprecedented, at least in democratic South Africa, rupture took place as student protests came to occupy center stage in the public imaginary. You had the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which challenged a statue of Cecil John Rhodes at the University of Cape Town. That morphed into what was called the Fees Must Fall movement, which started at Wits and really challenged higher education, its cost and its fees. I was bowled over to hear that it's 20 cents to study at UNAM. It's more like $2,800 to study at some of South Africa's best public universities. And despite some projects to ameliorate that for people of lower income, the question of student fees became a central issue just 5 years ago in South Africa, with huge protests ending up outside the presidential residence in Pretoria. Similarly, in terms of questions of femicide and gender justice, universities have also been a crucial site in South Africa for such struggles. And just last year, a student, first-year student who was murdered, a first-year student at the University of Cape Town, sparked tremendous protests about gender justice and femicide and sexual violence on university campuses. So what we've lost in this moment is universities being a locus of dissent and contestation. And I think that that loss has been quite important. And so in some ways, political dissent has been redistributed out of the university, perhaps into homes, perhaps into digital spheres. But we've seen a redistribution of that site of dissent outwards. And I think that that's a threat that we should be cognizant of. The second thing that I'd like to say is about the digitality of this moment and another threat of redistribution that it poses, before I come on to some of the opportunities. And here I think there's something of a paradox, because the university is both more open and more closed than it's ever been. And so never before have universities in South Africa been so silent and so dormant. But at the same time, never before has it been easier to participate in university events such as this one. And part of the digitality of this moment, I think, presents the way that universities are redistributing themselves with a number of threats. I think big technology has had its eye on the university sector for a long time. And this moment has, again, been paradoxical to the extent that while the university has redistributed itself and opened itself and allowed more voices in through digital technologies, at the broader level, we may be seeing a redistribution of power towards big tech, where the mediation of the university now happens via Facebook, via Zoom, via Google, via Twitter, via WhatsApp. And so although universities are fairer spaces internally, we may be seeing a redistribution of power more widely towards extreme concentrations within corporate technological spheres. And I think that that's something that we would need to keep our eye on as this process unfolds. And so the university's power to control its own internal borders, which it has wielded to quite devastating effect against student protesters in South Africa, for example, its power to commoditize its knowledge and disseminate it is coming under pressure from a far greater source of power. And so we may be seeing the university retreating in terms of the power that it's able to wield over the wider spectrum of society. The third thing that I think we need to bear in mind, having painted already quite a dystopian picture, is as all the speakers have said, and as Sarah says in her podcast, this opportunity also presents wonderful moments for hope. And I think we also need to reflect on some of those. The redistributions that are happening at the moment are quite profound. Firstly, I think an event like this is evidence enough that we would all probably have spent months planning to either be in Mexico or Johannesburg, and here we are having a completely cross-national conversation from the comfort of our living rooms. And I think that harnessing this moment where we can all convene at relatively low cost, both to our pockets and the environment, is an opportunity for us to think through how the university and different universities can come together and collaborate. I think secondly, the opportunity for teaching and learning across boundaries has opened dramatically. I, for example, am currently teaching at another university outside of South Africa in Europe. And while I'm also researching at Wits, doing a postdoc, which would have been impossible, I would have, you know, one is forced to only teach in the place where one is researching. Why? So the redistribution of teaching and learning outward, I think, is something that our institutions might benefit from dramatically. And as we go about constructing our curricula and our university lives, we might think about how we can bring in the resources of teaching, of digital teaching, into our universities at relatively low cost. So I think that just as universities may be redistributing some of their power out, there's also a chance for them to redistribute in, to let in more ideas and thoughts from outside, more people and thoughts from outside, and to ease some of the restrictions that were present prior to this moment of rupture. So I think essentially what I'm trying to say is that the concept of the redistributed university is a profoundly important one, not only as a political project to make the university a more fair space, and not only as a political project to make the university's intervention in society important, but it's also an important project from the perspective of the threats that are present in this moment. It's important to understand how the redistributed university, or how the university is being redistributed outwards, and how power itself is being redistributed, sometimes to the detriment of the project of the university. Thank you.
Thank you, Sizwe. Thanks so much. I think what happens now is that we return to Arturo, who will run the question session. Thanks to all.
Thank you, Sarah. I sent you a chat with the questions. Do you want to ask the participants, or should I ask the questions?
Why don't you do that?
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we have a couple of questions, and then it's not a specific question to anyone, but so anyone can answer these questions. The first one is, how are students going to have a voice nowadays in a dormant university without a physical space? So what is students' participation now? Are universities envisioning a more flexible model that will allow students who, for example, live far away from campus to permanently study online? Another question related to this one is this an opportunity to allow for a hybrid teaching learning models? And the last question, what will happen to students, to student movements and participation, and their participation in reshaping the university with COVID-19? So these are the questions that we have so far.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to make one comment. I'd like to make a comment and then ask colleagues to add, and it's a very brief one, which is an observation that I've been making along the way, but has been, I think, amplified by Sizwe's comments towards the end, and to some extent by Nair's at the beginning, which is the question of the politics of occupation, and what non-spatial ways there might be of making protest felt. So essentially the question of how to protect the right to protest in this moment. And you know, it's also been so notable to me thinking about 5 years ago to the month, when campus was full of noise and liveliness and student protest. The degree to which you know, students and universities might need to rethink how one would redefine occupation or some other forms of protest non-spatially. And it doesn't quite solve the question, I think, to think of sort of online platforms in which students might gather. So many thoughts about that. I read recently, of course, Judith Butler's observations on the right to assembly, but also very significantly in that book, where she, I think, makes one of the most profound sort of defenses of the right to gather and assemble, including on university campuses. She doesn't mention in that book, you know, sort of online protest communities. So very interesting questions around the physicality on which a politics of occupation is dependent. Yeah, thanks. So just an invitation to others then to take up other questions as well.
Now, anyone who would like to answer some of these questions? Imanol, thank you.
Well, I think that focusing on the idea that we are the possibilities of having a socially committed university, strongly connected to the community, a redistributed university, to summarize, we have agreed that it depends a lot on the mobilization of political forces and the balance of power between visions of the university, some of which are very conservative and think of universities in a very closed way as spaces for knowledge, disconnected with what's going outside in society. And I do think that the spatial situation that has been created by the pandemic has been totally against part of the possibilities of student movements and social collectives outside and inside universities have in order to express coalitions and create political power. I think that we have witnessed also for several years the how do you call it when you see something in the desert that isn't there? Espejismo.
Yes, mirage.
The idea that social networking is really where politics is taking place, and it's such a small world. And we think that opinions that are running wild in Facebook and Twitter really can impact society and public opinion and whatever, and it's not happening. So I do think that the spatial notion is very much connected to demobilization of students and other actors, faculty too, and that we need to address that. And we have seen how female students in the School of Chemistry at UNAM, finally, they just went and occupied the building, regardless of what was going on with the pandemic, in order to make it possible for them to get some victories. And the second thing is we need to be aware of all these opportunities that online and distance education are giving us. I think that Sizwe, you're right. It's true. We can get to a lot more people. We can connect to each other much more easily. But I can see public officials saying, oh, you know, you spend too much on traveling. There's a lot of tourism over there. And because they don't value what the social connections mean of we all being together somewhere and getting to hook up with the culture. I was in South Africa when they brought down the statue of Rhodes, and it was amazing just to read it on the papers. And you know, this is important, and it's important for students. What can happen if suddenly the idea that we can have really big enrollments through distance education becomes a central project, which is cheaper and easier? And it, in our view, and I think it addresses one of, and I finish with this, one of Sarah's comments at the very beginning, we are living outside what the meaning of going to the university has in terms of social connections, of interaction, of the building of a civic culture, a political culture of doing things together, that we are losing when the world becomes flat. There's a fabulous article by Martín Caparrós in the New York Times. It's called "The World is Flat." And it's flat for us today because we just see it on the screen and it's only two-dimensional. And we've lost a lot, and we have to be careful to limit the opportunity of the distance and virtual connections that we can establish in order not to lose the best part of the presence and direct connection between people in higher education. Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in then. Yes, absolutely. And I hope what I said will not impact my chances of being invited to Mexico one day when this is all done. So absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think that some of the threats you identify, even in this digital moment, are absolutely present. And I suspect, as I was saying with big tech, that certain corporations are licking their lips at the notion that the university is becoming increasingly digitized, and we may see moves in that direction going forward. One point I wanted to come to in terms of the question that was asked is this question of student protest and student movements, and I think it's just sad to say that there's been a tremendous demobilization, and it's going to be difficult to see how the kinds of spatialized protests that were so important to reconfiguring South African universities and society can take place now. And so whereas I think South African administrators 5 years ago were maybe the unluckiest administrators in democratic South Africa, I think they're now the luckiest. But also, and just finally, I think that there may be new forms of digital protest that might be thought through, and we shall have to see how that works out. But there could be spamming of Zoom meetings, there could be hacking of university administrative meetings. Not to give any people any ideas, but there are various forms of new disruption that the longer this moment goes on, I think will emerge, and those will be interesting to watch unfold.
Thank you, Sizwe. Yes.
Thanks. So notwithstanding, some of my concerns about the burgeoning industry also around online educational platforms and so forth, that we anticipate in the next couple of years, Sizwe's comment about the chances of tech companies really dominating university spaces in the future, and of course, this kind of dystopian idea, of course, I think is not so fanciful. I think it's something that one has to really, really be careful of. That being said, though, I do think that what we're going to see in all likelihood are much more flexible learning solutions inside university spaces. I think that there are possibilities for enhancing access through blended models, high flex models, the mix between face-to-face, synchronous, asynchronous, part-time, full-time, etc. I think that this is likely to be part and parcel of what a new university's offerings are likely to be. And I say that not simply from a perspective of delivery, but I do want us to think a little bit about what that means for the flexibility of pedagogies. Because it starts to allow for a kind of set of flexible pedagogies that extend way beyond what has been commonplace in the university, to think about those borderlands between that which sits inside the university and that which sits outside, in the kind of immediate social context in which universities are located. Beyond that, I think it also opens up the possibility then for flexible curricula. And I think that this speaks very, very deeply to the kind of work on what it is to reimagine the idea of the canon. And so I think that there are possibilities here that we're not necessarily always thinking about while we're thinking about those downsides to the institution itself. On the second matter of spatiality, like all new technological advancements, if I may say, one technology never simply replaces another. I can't see online delivery platforms simply replacing our face-to-face engagements in the world. And I suspect that what you will see are mixes of the two at sites of resistance and social protest. In the same way that you're seeing hybrid learning, I think you may very well see hybrid forms of social resistance, social protest, and so forth. And I say that again because I think that what you're going to see is the possibility of a kind of rebound effect, where those who have used the university as a space, as a physical site in order to mobilize, I think will understand its value much more significantly. And so I think you're going to probably see a kind of rebound into the spatial once more. So I'll leave it there.
Nair, don't you want to comment on what you're hearing?
Well, I agree with what has been said. I really think what will happen both to this idea of the possibility of protest and assembly and of teaching is that we will have to consider these mixed forms, this flexibility. And as Imanol said, we just had it last week at the university. Even though everything is closed and we are online, there was a physical, presential protest at the Faculty of Chemistry, precisely because there had been sexual harassment by two of the lecturers and they were caught in the camera. So this will be another issue, no? But we don't know.
Online.
Online, yeah.
Online sexual harassment, that was amazing.
Wow. Yeah. And it speaks of how difficult it is to take these ideas out of some people, no? How can they still be doing the same? It's beyond us. But, and also, for instance, in our faculty, because that stoppage really ended because of the fear of COVID, but the issues continue to be there, we have had to continue dealing with the problem and trying to find different solutions. And mostly it was done online, even having conversations with many of the female students and their representatives online. But we are worried about having any other kind of protest, and we don't know whether it will be presential, physical, or by online means. So this is something that we will learn in the following year. What will happen, Imanol?
If I can make a really brief couple of comments. One is this experience that we talked about of the female students in chemistry. you can see how fast traditional powers react. The deans of schools have forbidden students from recording what is going on online, interactions online between faculty and students. And they have charged students saying this is a very strong offense because this is going against academic freedom. Faculty can say whatever they want. So you can see how power reacts so fast in order to limit even the possibilities of action. The second thing that I would comment on, Garth, I agree with you, Garth, but my problem is when the children of the wealthy get the full-time experience of being on campus. And as you look at lower stratum socioeconomic status, then you get more blended into more virtual. And if we could manage to give the richness of both the blended and the factual personal interaction to everybody, regardless of their economic condition, then it would be something that I would consider a real opportunity. And we should target that. We should move in that direction.
Sorry, Sarah, I think Alicia also has a comment, and I also would like to ask a question, if I may. Are we also like facing somehow a massification of the education? As Sizwe said, like he's now teaching online, as many other people are teaching online, and that actually will reach a broader audience, and then we don't need a physical space. I mean, the physical space doesn't exist. So now instead of having classes with 30, 40 students, it can be 400, it can be more people like teaching. And are we also facing a massification of the education that actually will be led by highly ranked and well-recognized universities? And Alicia, I don't know if you would like to.
Yes, I would like to make a comment to Imanol and also to Nair. The first one is that, as I have been hearing you, is that the public universities in the Global South are the melting pot of all the social classes in the country. And I think this is very important, and it is very, as I studied in UNAM, is, well, many years ago, you see how interact all the social classes. The problem that we have had is that during the 50 years, during the last 50 years, all the austerity programs of the International Monetary Fund has decreased the budget to the universities. So now we just can open to more students the classes or more places, and also the austerity in having I don't know how to say in English, the plazas. We can just have more teachers because it is
tenured.
We just can have more tenures because the austerity program just can't allow to have more teachers and more students. And the other thing that I was to comment is Nair talked about this new movement that we are seeing, this right movement, that it is really it's really scary. It is like going to the 30 years. They are afraid of the communists, of the abortion, and they are very Catholic. So this is a mission, and I think we have to study very well because it is, well, it is just the right movement, and we have to think also in the double movement of Polanyi. So we have to take care. Thank you very much, and it has been a wonderful session, and we must continue in participate more academics with Witwatersrand University. Thank you very much, and congratulations. Thank you, Arturo.
Thank you, Alicia.
I mean, I think we should finish soon, but I think Garth should possibly respond to Arturo's question. Garth, would you like to? I mean, how are you thinking about this question of massification and teaching in the faculty at Wits.
So of course, thanks, Sarah, thanks, Arturo. I mean, I think that the question about massification is always going to be a debate that centers around, or centers on, the kind of tension between increasing enrollment numbers in a, almost an infinite manner to ensure certain, income and revenue streams for institutions, versus the question of access. So in a country like South Africa, for example, where you think about the historical legacy and the lack of access to higher education institutions, this debate is always going to be one where I think that we're going to be measured, have to be measured in that. My sense is that some degree of access that some may refer to as massification, I think is probably going to be inevitable as an outcome of this particular set of exigent circumstances in South Africa. To give you an example, at our institution, we take on something like, on average, about 4,000 or 5,000 new students each year. But we get anywhere in the region of 70,000 to 80,000 applications each year. Now, this gives you a sense of the kind of need that exists. And part of that need is not only a need of, that students have today because they believe that university education will give them access to the job market. This is also a kind of legacy issue. I don't think that we should underplay the fact that we're only 25 years into democratic South Africa and the legacy issues remain. We're really only a generation and a bit into democratic dispensation in South Africa. And so my sense is that we're going to have to try to balance the question of access with question of capping. And I mean, I think that we're going to have to think about this, capping the idea that you can actually simply enroll infinitely into institutions, because I think the point that Imanol then raises becomes a very real possibility, and that is that you start to have a tiered system of offerings inside higher education institutions. The wealthy get access to the online version and the face-to-face version and the part-time version, and those who have less and less resources get access to less and less and less. And so this, for me, is a kind of tension that has to be managed inside the institution. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is to think quite deeply about what kind of central value system an institution has around questions of access today. And then secondly, related to that is, what is the kind of cap that you put on institutions to run rampant around essentially the enrollment of infinite numbers of students? There are some universities in South Africa at the moment that are pursuing the possibility of hundreds of thousands of students, because they're thinking about the penetration of their infrastructure into the rest of Africa already. And so one has got to question what the pedagogic value is here, what the political value is here, what the economic value is here, and whether you aren't starting to do something that is somewhat, reminiscent, actually, of a similar kind of hierarchical relationship with other countries in other parts of Africa, at least. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should finish here, Arturo. I don't know what you think, but once again, it's so strikingly clear that if we think collaboratively, we can cover a lot of ground. And if we can talk south, we can cover a lot of ground that is particularly pertinent to what it is that we're dealing with in our contexts. So from my side, I think we should conclude with thanks, but over to you, Arturo.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, everyone, for this very interesting discussion around the situation of our universities nowadays. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening and afternoon in Mexico. Thank you.
I think we're short and sweet. Thanks to all. It's been incredibly interesting, and thanks for your time.
Thank
really
you.
good.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everybody.
much. Good night. Thanks very much. Yeah.